I'm standing just outside the royal birthing chamber, right in the bustling core of Madrid, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of incense and a palpable sense of dread. Servants scurry around me, their hushed voices cutting through the tension like sharp blades. Behind those massive oak doors, the queen's cries of agony echo, raw and piercing. It's 1,661, and the entire nation of Spain seems to be holding its collective breath, waiting for news. Then, a sudden hush falls over the room. A midwife steps out, her hands shaking, stained red with blood, her face grim and devoid of joy. She doesn't beam with pride or proclaim the birth of a prince. Instead, she locks eyes with the gathered nobles and murmurs. Something's wrong with him. Inside that chamber, the Queen of Spain lies unconscious, drained from the ordeal. Next to her, wrapped in fine silk and treated with reverence, lies her newborn son, Charles II, a child who inspires more fear than celebration. At first glance, he looks frail, his body misshapen, eerily quiet in a way that unsettles everyone. His tongue seems too big for his tiny mouth, making it hard for him to even breathe properly. His jaw sticks out in a way that's unnatural, almost grotesque. His little body lies limp, without strength or vigor. He can't feed like other infants, unable to suckle from his mother. He doesn't wail or cry like a healthy baby should. Yet the nurses bow low, showing respect despite their unease. The nobles clap politely, their applause hollow but expected. He's royal, after Allah Habsburg, heir to a mighty lineage. But what everyone sees, though no one dares say it, is that this child is a troubling omen. This boy is the product of a dynasty so fixated on keeping its bloodline pure that it's collapsed under its own weight, like silk left to rot. He's not just a newborn, he's a living curse, destined to wear a crown. And still, they all play along, pretending this is normal, that a boy who can't feed, move, or focus his eyes is fit to rule a sprawling empire. But in private, the whispers start to spread like wildfire. Some say he's cursed, bewitched by some dark force. Others call him a divine punishment for the Habsburgs' arrogance. Surely, they mutter, God wouldn't craft a king so broken. Yet, he will be king, because this is Spain, and the Habsburgs have spent centuries weaving their doom through marriages between kin. Today marks the beginning of their downfall, a reckoning long in the making. It all starts here, with a queen who's given birth to a child some might call monstrous. They spoke of royal blood, a phrase that sounded holy, grand, almost sacred. But what they wouldn't admit out loud was that this royal blood wasn't just blessed, was tainted, twisted by generations of inbreeding. For years, cousins married cousins, uncles wed their nieces over and over. The Habsburg bloodline looped back on itself, like a serpent eating its own tail. At the heart of this tangled genetic mess stood the Habsburgs, Europe's mightiest family, yet perhaps its most biologically cursed. To grasp why one child could be born so tragically flawed, we need to look back centuries. The Habsburgs were obsessed with one thing above all: purity. They didn't trust anyone outside their family, certainly not commoners. They trusted only their own, marrying within the family time and again. The Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburgs became a single, warped family tree, knotted and sickly. Instead of spreading out, their lineage curled inward, like a fist clenched too tight. Joanna of Austria, an ancestor of the Queen, came from such intense inbreeding that her family portraits looked like distorted reflections in a warped mirror. Every face bore the same exaggerated features, especially that infamous Habsburg jaw. That jaw wasn't just a quirky trait, it was a glaring red flag. It grew so large that some couldn't even chew their food properly. Tongues swelled, making speech a struggle for many in the family. Mental illness, epilepsy, and infertility hid beneath the glittering facade of palace life. These truths were ignored because they were inconvenient, denied because they were too painful to face. By the 1600s, the Spanish Habsburgs' inbreeding was so extreme, It rivaled the genetic overlap of siblings. Whole branches of the family were like living experiments in genetic ruin. They looked regal on the outside, draped in silk and crowned with gold, but their bodies and minds were falling apart. Marianne of Austria, both niece and wife to King Philip IV, was chosen not for love, but for her Habsburg blood. She was the ideal bride because she was already part of the family, a perfect link in their twisted chain. She and Philip shared more DNA than a parent does with their child. When Marianne became pregnant, the court celebrated, expecting a new heir to carry on the dynasty. But they didn't realize the dynasty had already poisoned itself beyond saving. The child she bore wasn't a savior, was a warning sign made flesh. The moment he was born, the midwives could tell something was terribly off. The baby didn't cry out, didn't stir with life. His limbs hung lifeless, his skin a pale, sickly gray. When they finally heard a sound from him, it wasn't a healthy wail but a weak, gurgling cough that chilled the room. Court doctors rushed to calm the royal family, insisting he was just frail, that time would make him strong, that miracles happen in royal houses. But no miracle was on its way. This child wasn't merely sick. He was the result of every reckless choice made by monarchs who thought they could defy nature's rules. He was a genetic dead end, yet they crowned him anyway. They named him His Catholic Majesty, dressed him in fine linen, adorned him with jewels. They hailed his birth as if he were Spain's salvation. In reality, he was a curse given human form a boy who could barely swallow, his tongue too large, his bones too weak. Yet the kingdom bent itself around him, refusing to acknowledge the obvious, and placed him on a throne his body was never meant to hold. The empire needed a king, and Charles, broken or not, was their only heir. They called him Charles II, King of Spain, defender of the Catholic faith, ruler of an empire stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. But behind the grand titles, the gold-threaded robes, and the ceremonial sword was a boy who could hardly stand on his own. From the moment he entered the world, his body seemed to work against him. His head was too large for his fragile frame, his skull misshapen, pulsing strangely in the candlelight. His tongue was so swollen he could barely close his mouth, let alone form words. As a baby, he couldn't nurse properly. As a young child, he struggled to chew food. He'd choke on meat, gag on bread, and drool constantly, his nurses wiping his chin around the clock. His first teeth didn't appear until he was almost 4 years old. He didn't take his first steps until after 5, and even then, his walk was unsteady, almost pitiful, making courtiers look away in discomfort. Still, the empire put on a show, clapping and smiling as if all was well. To admit Charles was flawed would mean admitting the entire Habsburg dynasty was flawed. So they lied, dressing up their failure in fine clothes. They called his silence thoughtful, not a sign of deeper issues. They claimed his delays were touched by divine mystery, not evidence of damage. But behind the palace walls, the truth seeped through their carefully crafted illusions. In private, his tutors were at their wits' end. He struggled to read or write with any skill. People described him as slow, unable to focus, startled by loud sounds or bright lights. He'd spend hours staring at flickering candles or tracing the patterns on his robes, lost in his own world. When someone spoke to him, he rarely answered. When corrected, he'd sulk like a small child. Sometimes, he'd lash out without warning, striking servants, ripping his clothes, or even chewing on furniture edges. One ambassador noted, "The king seems more like a fragile creature kept alive by some miracle than a ruler chosen by God." Another wrote bluntly, "He won't last long." Yet Charles kept living, not through strength, but through a stubborn, almost grim persistence. His survival became a kind of grim spectacle, a political charade. His mother, Queen Marianne, took control, ruling in his name. She issued orders in secret, signed decrees for him, and used her son's frail body as a shield to wield true power. Whenever they carried Charles out to face the public, slumped in his ornate golden litter, his eyes dull and head tilting to one side, It reminded the people their king was still alive. As long as he drew breath, the empire clung to life, even though decay was eating away at both from the inside. At court, the mood grew heavy, almost suffocating, like a funeral that hadn't been announced. Ministers murmured in low tones, their voices cautious and guarded. Priests lingered nearby, always watching, as if expecting death to claim him any moment. Yet it never did. They kept Charles in chambers, filled with incense to cover the stench of his frequent infections. His bedsheets were swapped out twice daily because he couldn't control his body's functions. Yet the royal painters churned out portraits, crafting glowing lies with their brushes, giving him sharp cheekbones, bright eyes, and a confident smile. They hid his sagging jaw, his hollow stare, the trembling lips that betrayed his condition. The king was falling apart, but they had to display him, had to make the people believe in him, because there was no one else to take his place. The Habsburg dynasty had staked everything on this one frail boy. They needed him to live, to wed, to father an heir, even as his bones grew brittle and his mind slipped further away. The court kept whispering about his future, plotting as if it were possible. They spoke of him marrying a French princess, of him fathering strong sons, of the royal line enduring. But deep down, everyone knew Charles wasn't the dynasty's salvation, he was its curse. As he aged, the line between a man and a puppet grew blurry. They dressed him up, propped him in place, and paraded him before the court. But he was never truly present, sitting on the throne like a hollow shell, gurgling and trembling, a ghost in human form. They placed a golden crown on a head that hadn't fully formed, its weight almost cruel. The court was skilled at deception, they'd been perfecting it for centuries. But under Charles II, the charade became something grotesque, fragile, and downright absurd. They weren't just fooling the public. They were fooling themselves, unable to face the unbearable truth. The boy they'd crowned wasn't a king, he was a failing body with a royal title slapped on it. The empire itself had turned into a grand stage, built to keep up the pretense that all was well. The halls of the Alcazar shimmered with candlelight, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. Courtiers kept their voices steady, always smiling, always bowing, always playing their part. Every servant, minister, and ambassador became an actor in this theater of denial. If the king stared blankly, they called it deep contemplation. If he mumbled nonsense during a council meeting, they praised his unique approach to ruling. If he didn't respond at all, they nodded gravely, claiming his silence held profound wisdom. The portrait artists joined the act, painting Charles II as a figure of fantasy-healthy, poised, every bit a king. They slimmed his jaw, softened his sloping forehead, straightened his hunched frame. On canvas, he was a monarch. In reality, he looked like a man already dressed for his own burial. Foreign dignitaries arrived expecting grandeur, only to find a masquerade. One French envoy wrote back home, "I'm not sure what unsettles me more, the king's condition or the way they act like he's fine." At banquets held in his honor, Charles sat drooling into his wine, unable to manage a spoon. Musicians performed while he gazed blankly into the void. Once, a court dwarf slipped up during a show, blurting out, "This kingdom's ruled by a corpse." By dawn, the dwarf was gone, vanished without a trace. But it wasn't just Charles falling apart, it was the whole system of royal rule. Ministries descended into bitter squabbles. Nobles scrambled for influence over Queen Marianne, who held power behind the guise of being a devoted mother. Religious zealots saw Charles as proof of God's wrath and started creeping into court affairs. Priests muttered about exorcisms, while nobles swapped tales of curses. When crops withered or storms lashed the shores, they blamed the king's unnatural state. Some whispered he was under a spell. Others hinted he was the spell. And there, at the heart of it all, sat Charles, a silent star in a collapsing universe. His days were planned to the minute, not for duty's sake, but out of fear he might hurt himself if left alone too long. If he walked too far, he might crumple to the ground. If anyone spoke the truth to him, he might scream in distress. Queen Marianne kept a firm hold on him, deciding who could approach, who could touch him, who could see him at his weakest. She edited his letters, made his choices, and spoke for him when words failed him. He was a marionette, and she pulled the strings, desperate to maintain the illusion of control as the empire unraveled around her. In the palace chapel, prayers droned on endlessly. Priests chanting for the king's health, his mind, his ability to produce an heir. Despite his drooling, his seizures, his inability to string together a sentence, the court still planned for his marriage. They clung to the hope or pretended to that Charles could somehow father a child, that this broken bloodline could limp on for one more generation. But when foreign princesses arrived, they saw the grim reality. One French princess, meeting Charles for the first time, reportedly collapsed in shock. Another refused to take off her gloves, as if the air around him might carry some disease. Yet the court kept up the act, clapping, bowing, smiling, because admitting the truth would mean dismantling the empire itself. So they did what they'd always done, pointed to the crown, kissed his ring, and proclaimed, "Long live the king." Even as his mind frayed, his body failed, and Spain began to crumble alongside him. By the time Charles reached 20, the whispers had grown into a storm of gossip. They dubbed him El Hechizado, the bewitched king, as if his ailments could be blamed on sorcery instead of centuries of inbreeding. His body was breaking down faster than the court could conceal it. His jaw hung open most days, drool trailing down his chin in a constant stream. His hair fell out in patches, leaving his scalp bare and uneven. His skin turned a sickly, wax-like yellow, like a candle left too near a flame. His eyes, once just empty, now seemed tormented, twitching as if searching for escape from his own skull. Yet he still ruled, a decaying figure draped in velvet and crowned with gold. The court's next great lie was marriage. They needed an heir, needed to prove this broken man could somehow extend the bloodline. So they chose Marie-Louise of Orléans, a lively 17-year-old niece of France's Louis XIV, utterly unprepared for the nightmare awaiting her. On her wedding night, she was led to the royal bedchamber like a lamb to slaughter. Charles lay there, trembling, confused, bare, and frail. What happened in that room became the stuff of grim legendsome. Say he wept, others say he prayed, others claim he just stared at her, clueless, until attendants stepped in to guide him. One thing was clear: no child came from that night, or any night after. Physicians were summoned, potions brewed, Spanish fly, ground pearls, even powdered deer antler. Priests prayed, surgeons poked and prodded, but no cure could undo what generations of incest had wrought. Charles was barren, his body incapable of creating life. Marie-Louise withered by his side, her spirit breaking as she stopped eating, stopped smiling. She died at 26, officially from an intestinal blockage, but in truth, from despair. The court buried her with all the pomp and ceremony they could muster. Charles wailed at her coffin, tearing out clumps of his thinning hair in grief. Charles pleaded to lie beside his dead wife's body, convinced she'd somehow return to him. Within a year, the court found him another bride, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a sharp-witted, strong-willed German woman. She arrived with a retinue of priests and midwives, her sole purpose to bear a child for the king. But the outcome was no different. Months of rituals, silence, and shame, with no heir to show for it. Maria Anna, too, began to wither, her spirit drained by the impossible role thrust upon her. Charles aged like fruit gone bad, looking closer to 70 than 30. His bones curved unnaturally, his teeth dropped out, leaving him unable to chew. Servants pureed his food, spoon-feeding him while murmuring prayers under their breath. He soiled himself often, couldn't manage stairs, couldn't read, and forgot things almost as soon as they happened. Yet the crown still rested on his head, a symbol that refused to fall. The court turned to superstition, casting aside doctors for exorcists. They stripped Charles bare, doused him with holy water, and chanted Latin prayers over his trembling body. They burned herbs under his bed and urged him to confess sins he couldn't even comprehend. One priest claimed a Moorish sorcerer had cursed the king as punishment for his ancestors' wrongs. Nobody spoke of genetics, of chromosomes. No one dared voice the real truth. This wasn't witchcraft. It was the inevitable result of a family that refused to marry outside its own blood for 2 centuries. Charles wasn't bewitched. He was the living embodiment of the Habsburg legacy, a warning draped in silk robes. Yet there he sat, still on the throne, at the heart of a crumbling empire. Every breath he took was hailed as a miracle, every twitch seen as a sign from God. If Charles died, Spain would fall. There was no backup plan, no heir, no son. So they wrapped his failures in ceremony, treating him like a holy relic that still drew breath. They kept mirrors away from him, hid his reflection, spoke softly, calling him chosen, anointed, beloved. Charles, fading and vacant, seemed to believe Itter at least played along. When lies are all you've ever known, the truth feels like the real terror. By the time he hit 30, it was obvious Charles was dying, though no one could predict how long it would take. His body had been decaying slowly since the day he was born, yet it clung to life with the same stubborn will that held the Spanish Empire together, rotting, but not yet gone. The court became a war zone of hushed rumors, everyone asking the same question. Who would take the throne when Charles finally stopped breathing? His marriage to Marie-Louise had yielded only grief, and her death may be cancer, maybe poison, depending on the gossip, left no children behind. So, they pushed Charles to wed again, choosing Maria Anna of Neuburg for her family's reputation for producing sons. But even her fertile lineage couldn't undo the damage of a doomed bloodline. Charles remained barren, his seed as lifeless as the empire he was meant to lead. They turned back to priests, relics, and exorcists, desperate for a miracle. The Queen even demanded a spiritual inquiry to see if Charles was under a curse. Monks and mystics inspected his body, his bedding, even the ashes of his late wife. One report blamed his condition on sorcery slipped into poisoned chocolate. Another claimed Satan himself lurked in the royal bedchamber. Charles believed it all. How could he not? His entire life had been a carefully staged dream of kingship. And now, as his organs failed and his mind faded into a haze, he clung to superstition like a lifeline. He begged holy men to purify his body, slept with vials of holy water under his pillow, and wore amulets to ward off demons. But nothing worked. The truth was far simpler and far uglier. This wasn't the work of witches or devils. It was the final price of inbreeding, of blood turned toxic by centuries of arrogance. Charles wasn't cursed, he was the curse. His body began to rot from within, his skin taking on a sickly yellow pallor. His legs swelled grotesquely, his digestion failed, and his teeth loosened and fell out. His hair came out in clumps, his excrement was black and bloody, and his eyes grew cloudy with cataracts. Yet he remained on the throne, his failing body propped up like a sacred relic no one dared cast aside. Every morning, attendants dressed him in rich velvet robes, combed what little hair he had left, and set the crown atop his trembling head. They placed him before the court, where he sat like a wax figure melting under the sun's glare. His mind drifted. He mistook strangers for long-dead family, spoke in loops, and whispered to invisible figures in corners. Still, no one dared challenge him, because there was no successor, no heir to replace him. The Spanish Habsburg line had run dry, and the king was fading with it. In desperation, Charles dictated a will, but it was fought over, altered by scheming courtiers, tweaked by foreign agents, and rewritten by priests. France and Austria hovered like vultures, each pushing their own claimant to the throne. War loomed on the horizon, its shadow growing darker by the day. All they could do was wait. Wait for the final breath of a king who had lived too long and suffered too much. When Charles died in 1738, his autopsy horrified even the most hardened doctors. His heart was black, his lungs drowned in fluid, his intestines gangrenous, his testicles withered and decayed. His body, barely 100 pounds, held blood as thick as oil, the cursed royal blood. There were no sons to mourn him, no heirs to claim his broken crown, only the tolling of bells across a grieving empire. The silence that followed was vast, heavy, and impossible to fill. With Charles II's death, the Spanish Habsburgs ended, and in their place, a war erupted. That war would swallow Europe, redraw maps, and reshape the world, all because kings forgot they were mortal, and empires paid the cost. Charles's final breath came quietly as he lay beneath heavy velvet sheets in a darkened chamber, surrounded by relics, incense, and the thick haze of candle smoke. His eyes had lost focus days earlier, his lips muttering fragments of childhood memories, broken Latin, and the names of sisters long gone. The courtiers, priests, and queens still hovered, watching a man who hadn't realized he was already a corpse. The man they'd crowned with hope now died, in dreadnought of death itself, for he'd been dying since birth, but of what it meant to be the final link in a chain forged over centuries. He was the end of a bloodline that once ruled half the world. They called him Charles, but they might as well have called him Extinction. There was no grandeur in his passing, no noble last words, no wisdom passed to heirs. There was only decay. His body collapsed inward, his skin waxy, his breath a rasping choke that finally stopped. When it did, no one cried out. They just bowed their heads, as if they'd been practicing for this moment all along. And they had the death wasn't just of a king, but of a symbol, of empire, of divine right, of the idea that power could be handed down like a family treasure, untouched by consequences. Charles II laid bare the falsehood of that grand illusion. He was like a mirror held up to the monarchy, reflecting a truth so ugly it couldn't be ignored. When he died, that fragile lie shattered into pieces. In Madrid, the bells tolled for hours, their somber chimes echoing through the city. By royal order, Spain was told to mourn, but the people had little left to offer. Famine had already sapped their strength, leaving them hollow. Taxes had robbed them of any hope for a better future. The king's death wasn't a tragedy, was a long overdue sigh of relief. The end of a painful wait, the collapse of the pretense that things could keep going as they were. Across Europe, embassies buzzed with activity, bursting into chaos. The French and Austrian dynasties, both claiming rights to Spain's throne, rallied their armies before Charles's body had even cooled. In mere weeks, Spain stopped being a proud empire and became a battleground, a chessboard for foreign powers. Charles, like a pawn knocked over in the game, was finally cleared from the board. The War of the Spanish Succession dragged on for over a decade, claiming countless lives, pulling in every major European power, and leaving Spain's empire in ruins. The colonies in the Americas began to revolt, breaking away from a weakened crown. The royal treasury drained dry, its coffers empty. The world moved forward, leaving Spain behind. But deep beneath the marble floors of the Alcazar, in a tomb far grander than Charles ever warranted, his bones still rest blackened, crumbling, encased in gold. He ruled for nearly 40 years, yet left nothing behind. No heirs, no victories, no legacy, except a stark warning. His life and death teach us what happens when power becomes a birthright instead of a duty. When bloodlines are valued over ability, when rulers see themselves as divine and forget that even gods can bleed. Charles didn't lose his empire, he was the loss. History celebrates kings for their triumphs, their conquests, their golden statues and lavish tombs. But Charles II left no victories, no monuments worth seeing, only a caution etched in his frail bones. His reign wasn't defined by what he accomplished, but by what he was, a man consumed by the very bloodline that placed a crown on his head. He was the final note in a story that had dragged on too long, a dynasty so obsessed with purity it bred itself into oblivion. In Charles, that obsession took physical form, a body warped by centuries of arrogance, a mind shattered by generations of entitled whispers. He wasn't evil, nor was he a tyrant, was simply the result. A living relic of a system that thought power could be passed down like a family heirloom, no matter the cost. He carried the weight of that mistake with every trembling step, every seizure, every drooling ceremony in a palace that had turned into a mausoleum. What makes his story so chilling isn't just the grotesque decay of his body. It's how long everyone around him pretended everything was fine. The silence, the complicity, the gold-trimmed charade that cloaked his suffering. Nobody wanted to admit the system itself had broken. Charles didn't destroy the empire. The empire destroyed itself, using him as its instrument. That's the real horror, not madness or disease, but a machine that kept grinding on long after it should have stopped, fueled by superstition, pride, and tainted blood. Until the last king of Spain's greatest dynasty sat drooling on his throne, the world collapsing around him, and no one dared speak the truth. This wasn't just the death of a king, it was the death of a system that devoured itself.